Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Gornoi, and I lead on security operations consulting for PwC UK. And this is actually my first time visiting the Channel Islands, so thank you very much for taking the time to come listen and for making this a pretty amazing welcome for me. In my role at PwC, I get involved in all the security operations consulting and engineering work that we do. From some of the largest projects, like helping an international firm consolidate 17 legacy SIEM instances into one single modern one, to some of the smaller projects, like helping a nonprofit write a contract to outsource their SOC. And in the presentation today, I'm looking to share some of the perspectives that my team and I are seeing in terms of the trends in this space, and also how we've looked to respond to these trends. Both within PwC as a firm and also with our clients in the market. And overall, I think I have three key messages for the presentation today. First, that when it comes to security operations, that world has truly changed. If you were building a SOC today, then it would look very different compared to how you would have built it if you were building it, let's say, 3 years ago. And there's a few reasons for that. The products, services, and architectural options in the market have changed, so that the building blocks from which you would be building your SOC are different. The broader technology, kind of cyber technology ecosystem, and the expectations towards it have shifted, so that our organizations, the organizations we're all looking to protect, are thinking about cyber and are expecting different things from cyber. And invariably, there's also been a shift in the external threat landscape, with external threat groups and threat actors coming up with new behaviors and techniques that require action on behalf of the defenders. My second message is that in that change, there's both opportunity and challenge. The challenge comes from the fact that if you don't keep up your security operations capability, then your existing SOC over time might either become ineffective in providing assurance over the modern threats today, or it will become too ineffective. It will become too expensive to maintain. The opportunity, though, is that when we look at the change drivers, then there's one unifying theme how you can respond to that change well, and that is investing through more automation when it comes to security operations. And that's whether you're doing that in-house, so if you have the scale to invest in engineering in-house in your SOC, or whether you're looking to arrive at a more equitable arrangement in terms of sharing the benefits of automation with your managed service partners and external partners. And my third message, perhaps for those who are skeptical, who have tried automating their security operations capability before, would be that the barriers for doing that today, so the barriers of entry, are lower than they've ever been before. And later in the talk, I'll provide a few kind of practical examples how we've gone about automating our SOC in PwC and also in the context of our managed services that we provide to others. Before I do that, though, can I just gauge, there's lights in my face, but can I gauge who is in the room? So can you put your hand up if you either worked in a SOC or have directly managed the SecOps capability? Okay, so I have a few hands. Would any of you brave ladies and gentlemen like to add anything to that? How did you find the experience? Was it fun? Was it challenging? No? Okay, that is, I think, a challenge in every SOC, for sure. So, well, look, as someone who's managed security operations teams in a few places, and before joining PwC, I ran an enterprise team of about 40. I can very much, relate to that, and I think some of the other feedback that I usually hear when I speak to my peers, and it's that looking after a security operations capability can be very exciting. It's an exciting place, but it's also a pretty hard job. And for those of you, I suppose, who haven't been as closely working in SecOps, I'll just say a few things to set the scene. So when I refer to a SecOps function, there's no standard definition for what's included and what's excluded from that. But typically, there are some core mission statements that are common across the market. And it's that, a SecOps function at its core is the capability within the organization that's tasked with operating the technology, the services, and the controls to detect malicious cyber activity that's directed towards the organization, and also to respond to that effectively. Any SecOps function will also need to be able to keep up with business change. So if the organization changes and the technology that supports the organization changes, then that capability to detect and respond must stay current and effective over time. And it also must do so within a reasonable cost envelope. If we think about security operations budgets, they can easily make 40 to 60% of a CISO budget. And invariably, just the scale or the proportion of that will invite challenge. So when I'm talking about SecOps today, then really what I mean is a function within the organization or a capability that has a pretty straightforward mission with detection and response at its core, but that will often have a pretty challenging execution environment. So what's been happening in that space then? What are some of the trends that my team and I are thinking about? I'll talk about kind of three areas here, as I mentioned. One, the product set that underpins this, and how that's shifted. Secondly, the expectations that organizations have towards their cyber technology ecosystem. And thirdly, I'll say a few words about the threat developments. Now, without further ado, let's talk about products. So what you see on the screen now is the Gartner Magic Quadrant for SIEM services, so the security information and event management products, from about 3 years ago. And the top box, which kind of denotes the product category leaders, has been grayed out. Would anyone like to have a punt as to who were the vendors in that space 3 years ago? Logarithm? Yep, 2. So as a hint, there's 6. Good guess. Not sure about that one. Also a good guess. Okay, I'll spare you the pain. There were 6 vendors in that space. Logarithm and Splunk definitely feature, and there's a few more. Well, as a follow-up, would you like to also opine on where these guys are now? It's been acquired by Cisco, but it's still there. Okay, well, the bottom line is that 2 of those products that were considered market leaders in that category 3 years ago are no longer there. So QRadar, IBM have sold QRadar to Palo Alto Networks, who have made it clear that they're discontinuing this product. And Logarithm has been merged into Exabeam. And if we look at the remaining 4, then really all of them are losing market share at the moment. And why is that? Well, I think there's 2 interesting things that are happening in the SecOps space that kind of underpin that. Firstly, when we go back to that time, then the SIEM was really kind of the centerpiece of security operations. You would get data into the SIEM, and you would define your detection content in there to be able to detect malicious activity, and distinguish it from the noise. But these days, a lot of the detection has actually, either due to cost or efficiencies, has migrated out of the SIEM. So you might have come across, the development in EDR and XDR products on the endpoint, which essentially provide all the detection capability kind of closer to the action. And it's the same story when you look at other parts of an IT estate. If, let's say, we're talking about operational technology, so things that are sitting in physical sites and factories, very difficult to monitor that through a traditional SIEM. And there's a whole category of products that's grown around that provides detection closer to the devices. And equally, if we look at, let's say, cloud environments and things like Kubernetes or containers, also notoriously difficult to monitor via a SIEM product. And there's an ecosystem of products that provides detection in that space. So the first kind of interesting thing that's happened in SecOps is that the detection content has migrated out of the SIEM. And the second thing that I think has disrupted this market is the concept of platformization, with, I suppose, Microsoft being the most obvious example. Microsoft still provide Sentinel as a SIEM, but equally, they provide way more. So it's provided as almost a component of a broader security suite with Defender and other tools like Purview, so that the SIEM is not really kind of a be-all and end-all for the SOC. And Microsoft isn't unique in that space, with folks like Palo Alto or Google to an extent also looking to provide a security platform that includes the SIEM, but also includes other products. So as a result of that, I think the SIEM market has been pretty much permanently disrupted. And sure enough, Gartner have published a new Magic Quadrant just a couple of months ago, which looks very different to this one. But at the end of the day, SIEM is no longer the answer for the SOC that it used to be. If I now briefly turn to kind of the broader cyber technology ecosystem in organizations, then, and I kind of maybe simplify it quite a bit in terms of what we're seeing in PwC in that space, there's almost these two contradictory trends or things that are pulling into two different directions happening, where on one hand, if we think about our organizations, they continue to become more distributed and more complex in some ways architecturally. If we think about cloud services like SaaS, multi-cloud, hybrid deployments, operational technology, becoming more digitized, then there's, an organization typically still kind of losing some of its boundaries and moving away from its traditional focus on infrastructure. And on the other hand, there, kind of the countervailing flow is that from a risk management and a resilience management perspective, there's still a growing demand for more granular data to kind of underpin measurement in that space. Whether that's to justify further security investment or technology investment, whether that's to keep up with regulatory expectations, or whether that's just to keep up with what's been happening in the market when it comes to risk management and kind of demonstrate increasing maturity. So what that means for SecOps, really, is that, well, a SecOps function these days needs to be able to monitor that more distributed technology environment, which is perhaps moving away somewhat from infrastructure and migrating up the stack into identity that underpins the IT and some of the more kind of business-specific workloads. But on the other hand, a SecOps function also needs to be able to provide more real-time or more granular data about how it operates in a distributed ecosystem. And I'll say then a couple of words as well about what's been happening in the threat landscape. And I'm sure as consummate security technology professionals, you already know most of this, but I'll highlight maybe a few things that our PwC threat intelligence team considers important for SecOps. And in this space as well, there's kind of, I think, two key trends that I'd highlight. One is the continued development by advanced threat actors of techniques that help them blend in. And some kind of tag words around that are bespoke covert networks or operational relay networks, using residential proxies. And these are essentially things that kind of help the attackers hide their tracks and appear as though they're coming from somewhere else. There's the trend in targeting edge devices more than they've been targeted before. So that refers to attackers targeting things like network equipment or file transfer solutions that live on the edge of corporate networks, and that maybe have been underserved by EDR solutions and kind of more typical monitoring approaches, and that are very difficult to do forensics on. And also, as a second trend in this space, I'd highlight the continued importance of access brokers as kind of an initial access vector into organizations. And there's been some kind of taglines around that these days attackers no longer hack in, but they log in. And what that refers to, right, is that as the general maturity of a lot of the controls increases, attackers are increasingly turning to legitimate access that's been compromised to find their way in without detection. And that's whether they're reusing credentials that have been lost in attacks elsewhere, whether they're turning to folks who sell these credentials as a service, whether they're developing new techniques to, like attacker in the middle type approaches to steal two-factor authentication tokens and bypass two-factor authentication technology, targeting cloud tokens and authentication tokens. So essentially, the trend for the attackers in that space is to get hold of legitimate access and then blend in after that. And what both of these things mean for SecOps, again, what they mean is that it's increasingly difficult to rely on kind of infrastructure type standard signature-based detections of activity, and it is also difficult to rely on traditional kind of indicators of compromise or technical indicators. And in turn, that means that in the SecOps space, you kind of need to crunch through more data to figure out if someone is after you. And if I bring that all together, then, well, how do you respond to all of these developments? And there's many right answers. But if we look at enterprise security strategies, if we look at vendor roadmaps, and if we look at market surveys like this one from last year, then one of the key trends in terms of that answer is increased automation in the SOC, with terms like autonomous SOC or autonomic SOC being prevalent. And intuitively, I think it makes sense, because if you are looking to defend a more distributed and identity-based environment that's moving away from infrastructure, you're targeted by attackers who try to blend in much harder, and you're trying to detect and respond in that context without, mind you, burning out your analysts in the SOC or your providers who would have to do all of the sifting through the data manually, then achieving that without some level of automation engineering is becoming much more difficult. So I'll turn now to a few kind of practical ideas of how we've looked to respond to that then within PwC in terms of automating our own SOC, and how we've integrated that into our managed services. And well, before I do, just a few words about PwC. I'm sure some of you have come across us in the tax or audit space, or maybe even cyber. We are, in PwC, we are the biggest professional services network in the world. So we employ 350,000 people across more than 150 countries. And most of these folks are knowledge workers. So we can get away by being largely in the cloud. Although we do have some on-premise labs for specialist applications. And when it comes to which clouds, then no surprise. I think in addition to kind of having a commercial relationship with Microsoft in terms of collaborating on services, incident response, and so on, and like being one of the top professional services providers on top of Microsoft technology, we are also one of the largest customers of Microsoft products ourselves. So at least a few years ago, we were the third largest consumer of Microsoft services in the world. And that covers standard enterprise technology like M365, but also in many areas, we've taken the approach of almost being the first adopters and coming up with ways to use the technology in our business ourselves before we then factor into our consulting work. So on that front, we do have the biggest OpenAI deployment scale in Azure, and we also have over 100,000 Copilot licenses distributed around the business. But anyway, in any case, enough about PwC. I think whether you're representing a large organization or a small organization in this room, hopefully there's some similarities in that we're all trying to protect organizations that are turning towards the cloud, where there's a large Microsoft technology presence, and also that have to keep up with the business or the organization trying to innovate and take up new services like AI. So when we had an opportunity to rethink some of the elements of our own security operations setup a few years ago, we kind of looked at what's available in the market. What do our clients use? What can we see in industry publications? And the typical SOC kind of looked like that at that point, where the security operations analysts would receive alerts coming from the SIEM and a number of supplementary security capabilities. They would then do their best to try and match that up against threat intelligence information and like reading up about new attacks. And depending on their conclusions, they would then follow a set of playbooks or runbooks, essentially step-by-step guides that would help them understand what to do in those particular circumstances. And a lot of the time, those playbooks would also expect them to dip into the tools on the left to either get more context or take response action. And if there was any automation in that process, then it would typically be tagged towards the end to help the analysts perhaps take some of the action more quickly or more effectively. Well, so when we started rethinking our SOC, it was clear that we wanted to do something different from the outset. And I think the key parameters for us were about being more selective about how we use data and how we pull data into the SOC to avoid the noise, and to correlate it earlier with threat intelligence information, and also to ensure that throughout this process, whether that's detection, whether that's triage, or actual response, more of the burden would sit on machine rather than human analysts. And as a result, well, the big architectural decision we've kind of arrived at is instead of, and I guess thinking about some of the trends that I described earlier, we decided instead of putting the SIEM at the center of the SOC and kind of acting as a data collation and detection engine, we've put a SOAR capability at the center. So, security, orchestration and automation response capability. I mean, does that term, by the way, ring a bell? Like, how many of you are using SOAR capabilities today? Okay, a few folks. Again, any thoughts? What do you use it for? No? Okay, tough crowd. I'll talk about a couple of use cases specifically for us. But I mean, fundamentally for us, just this simple architectural shift has enabled quite a lot. And in practice, what this means is that instead of kind of bringing the data into the SIEM and then determining the detection behavior there with SOC analysts and having to take manual action, largely, when it comes to our SOAR capability, we pull alerts into it from different detection tools. And sure enough, SIEM can be one of the contributing inputs, but it's not the only input. And what this allows us to do, it allows us to do correlation earlier and essentially run automated workflows on literally every single thing that comes into the SOC before it even gets to a human analyst to review. And it also enables us to essentially close false positives and filter out noise automatically. And perhaps one of the easy ways to kind of illustrate that is to talk about Terence. So Terence is our robot analyst working in our security operations center. And his tagline is that he's the only analyst who works 24 hours a day and loves closing false positives. He does way more than that, though. So Terence is essentially a collection of playbooks and scripts that runs on every single case and incident that comes into our SOC automatically. And Terence fills in the gaps. So if anything comes in that needs enrichment, needs classification, he will take care of that. He will make sure that the incoming data is matched to data from other tools, pulling that data in selectively, including enriching any cases with threat intelligence that we have available. For example, adding in information about the source addresses that the attack originates from, any insight on malware, even doing automated malware analysis where possible. And also, essentially, Terence then takes care of some of the initial analysis that a SOC analyst would do. And if he can make a determination based on rules that this is essentially noise or another false positive, similar to a false positive already closed and assessed by a human analyst, then he will do that. And in fact, Terence works on more incidents for us than all of our human analysts combined. So he takes a massive load off our team, and that creates space for the team to do more meaningful security operations work. For example, creating more automation. And I'll kind of start concluding here, but I'll finish on a few thoughts in terms of where we're taking this now and how we're bringing AI into it. Fundamentally, we have two streams of further development. One is by linking this capability with kind of cloud-native orchestration capabilities. And I'm super excited about one project that we're doing right now where we're essentially building a modular architecture in Azure on the basis of logic apps and function apps that helps take action and contextualize incident work within the Azure cloud environment. And the second strand of development is essentially looking at how GenAI can support us even further. And I've kind of outlined a number of specific use cases we're considering in that space. Some of them have to do with essentially automation, but maybe less deterministic side of that. Some of it is to do with summarizing information, which is a typical GenAI use case, like pulling together post-incident summaries and analyzing trends that we've been seeing in the SOC over the last month. Some of it, refers to essentially freeing up more analyst time in other ways, like providing a language-based interface for the analysts to interrogate the data that we have across our systems, or essentially providing a human language interface for other people outside of the security function to interface with security data in meaningful ways. And also, a couple of other use cases around threat modeling. For example, if we're required or if we need to develop new detection capability for a new project, or things like automated risk reporting for reporting on what's happening in the SOC. And, well, at this point, I think I'll conclude. And I'm happy to take questions now or later over drinks. But I'll kind of summarize a few things that I covered today. So, I spoke about some of the key trends we in PwC consider pertinent for security operations. And I've hopefully provided you some insight into how automation and AI fits into that in terms of how we respond to it. And the key messages, if there are any takeaways, are that, well, look, this world has changed, and the options you have for building a SOC truly look different to what were there before. And if you are looking to respond to that change and keep up with the market, then investing into more automation is a pretty good way to go. And I'll again emphasize that's whether you're doing that in-house or whether you're doing to get more benefit out of your third parties. So I think a bad outcome in that space is essentially, if you're working with a managed SOC provider, for them to implement automation and just take the cost improvements through that for their own firm. If you are working with a third party who provides a managed SOC, then you should also be benefiting from some of that automation that they build. And thirdly, well, you can build some of this on top of legacy solutions, but more often than not, if you haven't reviewed your SOC architecture for a few years, then now's actually a pretty good time to do it. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. As you say, we do have a moment or two for questions, if there are any hands leaping up in the audience. Will, just give it a mo for a microphone. Thank you.
Very much, Alex. I think there's a lot more people who are now using a SIM than there probably was, but there's probably still a lot of businesses which don't have one at all, which means that there's even less people right now who've got SOAR capabilities. Do you think that will change anytime soon, or actually are we all going to wait till it's autonomous SOCs and autonomous SIMs?
Well, I think waiting generally is, it is a strategy, but it's usually not the most effective one if you're faced with increased threat. Well, I mean, one of the learnings from us as we were implementing this was that you kind of need different skill sets for the future in the team to make this possible. When we first started automating in the SOC, a lot of the automation was defined by our SOC analysts at the time. And really what you need in this space are engineers and developers, right? So to an extent, it was a success in retraining folks to start thinking instead of doing about how you automate what you do. But sometimes it also didn't gel with, folks kind of not picking up the new mindset. So I think that's one observation I'll make on that is that, yes, there's SOAR capability out there, but to make use of that, you kind of need new skills, which are often difficult to get. And that's why, again, I kind of come back to the point that, if you don't have the scale to do it in-house, I wouldn't recommend it. Like, there are managed service options out there, though, that can build and develop that for you.
Any more questions? If not, I shall say, Alex Gornoi from PwC, thank you very much indeed.